We left off last week with, remember, Abimelech has asked Isaac to move away from his city because Isaac's become too wealthy, too powerful. And he wants him to get away from him, away from Gerar. Now, I have to go back and recant something I said earlier. We talked about Abimelech being really old because it's been 70, 80. It's actually, by the time in a bit, Isaac's going to interact more with him. It's been almost 90 years. So very likely what's going on, and this was common in that time, was that Abimelech, and remember Phicol was the name of the commander of the army. Most likely those are titles as well as names. That each person that takes that position takes that title or that name. We would call them like Abimelech the first, the second, But they don't because they only have one at a time. So they just call them Abimelech and Phicol. It'd be like us saying president and commander-in-chief, that type of thing. And so very likely that's how it progresses down because there's no way they're still alive. They'd be 115, 120. If they are still alive, they certainly wouldn't be leaders because people aren't living a long time at this point. So most likely it's titles. Okay, let's see. What do I got here? Now, this made me think. This city of Gerar that has an army is afraid of Isaac, the herdsman. And so you kind of have to say, why? And the point, so I asked myself the question, how many servants would Isaac have? Because that's got to be the issue. It's not the wealth that's scaring him. It's got to be that he has enough fighting men that, Abimelech thinks those fighting men could defeat his military and take over the city. And remember at this time we had what were called city-states. We didn't really have like empires like we have now, that we have as we move farther along. We have what we call city-states. A city, a king, we would actually refer to him more as a mayor or a governor. But they'd call him a king, would rise up in a city, and then he would usually take over the lands around him because they would use them for agriculture, and he would basically go out as far as he was strong enough to go until he bumped into another city-state that would fight back. And there were a lot of wars between city-states, but they're just individual cities. So when you hear about them, we're not talking about armies with 100,000 men, 200,000 men. We're talking about an army of maybe a few thousand because it's one city. And these cities weren't huge. They were 20, 30, 40,000 people, would be a very large city in that time. So I got to thinking about this. Okay, how many servants would Isaac have at this point? And the only real reference we have on this is the fact that we are told that, remember, Abraham had 318 fighting men before Isaac was born. That's just the fighting men in as his servants. So let's just take that as a starting point and say, well, let's say that each of these men, most likely every one of these men had a wife. And because that, you didn't stay a bachelor back in that day. You got married and had kids. Let's say they just had 4. We know that they actually had more, but like 6, 8, 10, that type of thing. The more, the better. They wanted as many kids as possible. And the idea with population is it's logarithmic. It's not linear. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4. It goes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, that type of thing. So if each family had 4 children, and you considered a new generation to be a period of 20 years, you get 20, you get married, you have kids, that type of thing. It's kind of surprising when you look at this. And I just used the 60 years because we know Isaac is around 60. So we're just going to use that time period. Here's what Isaac would have. 20,352 servants. That's if they just had 4 kids. He would have 20,000 servants. That's enormous. I'm not saying he did, I'm saying he could. And very likely he had something close to this. Because remember, we're told he's extremely wealthy and very powerful, enough that an entire established city is scared of him and ask him to move somewhere else. So he could have as many as 20, he could have more than 20,000 if they had 10, 12, kids. Now also remember though, a lot of kids didn't make it past birth. That's why I chose 4. That 4 made it all the way to adulthood because dying in childbirth was the number 1 cause of death for women and kids during this time period. So that's why Abimelech wants him to move away. I mean, we would do the same thing. You're the king of a city. You've got an army of 10,000, and outside your gates is a guy that's got 20,000, hanging around out there, and extreme wealth. which means he could outfit all of his people with armor and weaponry if that's what he wanted to do. He didn't. These were herdsmen, mostly farmers. That's who his servants were. But it kind of makes you think. When we go through this and read it, we think, oh yeah, he had a lot of people, he was afraid of them. But when you really put numbers to it, it's kind of astounding. 20,000 servants, that's a city by itself. But also think about all the work that Isaac had to do to manage all that. All the herds, money, and people, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we pick it up with Genesis 26:17. Let's see. So Isaac departed from there, and he camped in the valley of Gerar. So he didn't go real far. He left the city of Gerar, and he went out in the valley, far enough away where they couldn't see him. He's not a threat, that kind of stuff. He settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the names that his father had given him. So he just moves out into the country, and he goes into this very large, wide valley. And here's a picture of what part of that valley looks like. Okay, this is just one small area. But what you can tell is it's very good grazing land. There's all this growth there. Now, these are flowers, but still there would be grass and flowers. And there's a lot of farming that goes on in that area to this day. It's a relatively good area for farming and for grazing. So we're also told that he settled there, which Isaac would then make that like his base. He can't keep all of his herds and flocks there because they're going to eat everything up in a short period of time. So he would send out groups of herdsmen with the different ones and just send them all over. And they could be many miles away from where his base is. But he doesn't need to move around. He's the big kahuna. He's the boss man. And so they would set up an encampment. That's where they would then grow crops and send out food to the herdsmen that are scattered all over the place and that type of thing. So he would take up a lot of space, a lot of area out around there. Because again, this area is not a lot of rainfall. And so there is grass there, but it's not like, it rains all the time and the grass grows really fast. It's an area I grew up in New Mexico. My grandfather was a well driller in the mountains. It's a little town called Mountaineer, New Mexico. And I will have you know that in the 1800s, it was the pinto bean capital of the world. This little town on the backside of this mountain, because it rained like 3 times a week during the summer, just like you were irrigating. And all these settlers came in back then and saw, this big, it's on the backside of a mountain, but it's a big mesa, so it's flat. And they said, wow, and they started growing beans. And you can go to the town, they still have the big bean barns down at the railroad where they used to bring the beans in and put them in and load them into rail cars, that type of stuff. And but then all of a sudden, probably due to this, the weather changed dramatically towards the beginning of the 1900s. It stopped raining. And this is one of the driest places I've ever been. I mean, I grew up in New Mexico, which is desert, but there are no perennial bodies of water anywhere on the backside of this mountain. There are no streams, no lakes, no rivers, nothing. Stopped raining. And this is back in the days when people really took care of the land. When the settlers left, they threw grass seed out all over their planted fields and then left. And about 50 years later, in come these cowboys from Texas with herds of cattle. And they see grass like this. And they're from Texas, where it rains all the time. So they put this enormous amount of cattle out there, and in a very short period of time, they eat all the grass down, and they're waiting for it to grow back. And they don't realize it took 40 years for that grass to grow that high. And almost put them out of business. So I'm very aware of that. And like this, same thing here. It's dry. There is grass, but it doesn't grow real fast and come back real fast. So you've got to spread way out. Oh, by the way, they still grow pinto beans there too. But they irrigate them now. So although, they, being a super dry area, because of global warming, they've been getting more rain than they've had in the past 100 years as well.
Are we having global warming, or are we just having a shifting of the weather and the planet?
By global warming, I simply mean the planet's getting warmer. That's it. Man has nothing to do with it. But we can measure the average temperatures, and it is warmer. And weather patterns are changing.
And they change, yeah, right.
But they've been doing that since God created the earth. You can look in history and see that it happens over and over again. That's why I'm so astounded that scientists have bought into this political idea and are so narrowed on it that they just ignore the history all around it. We've brought it up before. Just go back to the 1st century. There's a whole bunch of Roman coastal cities where people lived in the first century. Those cities are under 80 feet of water out in the harbor now. Well, that tells us something. An enormous amount of ice melted at the polar ice caps and glaciers in order to change the entire ocean by 80 feet, just from the first century till now. And this is also interesting, all the same scientists will tell you that in ancient history, like the time period we're at here with Abraham and Isaac, the ocean levels were 400 feet higher than they are now. The coasts were much farther inland than they are now. And then what came after that, we call it the Great Ice Age. What happened?
Right.
All that water got frozen in the North and South Poles and glaciers, like on Iceland and Greenland and different places. And it's like you look at all that and you go, how can you possibly be saying man's causing this? It's been going on since the beginning, and it's obvious it's been going on since the beginning. But the Earth is getting warmer. We're seeing it. I believe it's just the activity of the sun. It's the only thing that has enough power to change the climate of the Earth. I mean, this is a big system. And yet the sun does. It puts out more sunspots, more energy, and then it cools, you know. And we've just gone through a cooling period. Now we're heading into a warming period. Also, if you guys remember back in the 70s, remember what the climate scientists were predicting in the 70s? We were going into, we're going into an ice age. And the next thing you know, we're going into global warming and we're all going to die from the heat. And you're like, well, make up your mind. Which is it?
It's just fear tactic.
Well, they also use the same software to predict that they predict rain next week. And I just told you that I looked at their predictions and it wasn't going to rain for 10 days, and it rained an hour after I washed my car. So, so they're telling us 100 years from now, we can tell you what the weather's going to be, but tomorrow, not so much.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Really. So, the guy that wrote Jurassic Park, not a Christian, he just wrote a book that said, you're using the same modeling software you use to predict other weather, and it's very inaccurate. How can you tell us 100 years from now? Oh my gosh, he got ripped to shreds in the media. Of course, nobody ever countered what he said. They just called him names and said he was anti-scientific and all this stuff. I mean, they just piled on this guy because he had the audacity to say, wait a minute, let's think about this for a minute, So, all right. Now, Abimelech didn't make him leave the country completely. He just wanted him away from the city where Isaac wouldn't be tempted to take over the city. That type of thing. So, which makes us think, again, as I looked at all the number of servants, he must have had a lot of fighting men. Now, here's the part that I find very interesting. They live in an area with very little water, virtually hardly any streams or anything like that. And it's an area for grazing far more than it is for farming. Some areas can be farmed, but most of it's just grazing land. And yet, Abraham had dug all these wells and found water, and Abimelech's herdsmen come behind him and do what? Fill them in. What kind of person fills in a working well in the desert? But what we have to remember is, if you dug a well and you hit water, in their world, that gave you a claim to the land around the well. So even though Abraham didn't claim any land, neither does Isaac, that would give them the right to claim part of Abimelech's land. So very likely Abimelech told them, fill them in. And so they did. But I noticed they didn't dig any new ones. They just filled in those. Also probably to try to keep Isaac and Abraham out of those areas as well. If there's no water, you can't take your flocks there. So let's see. Now this valley was very sparsely inhabited. Might have been some in there, but it was mostly you just run into other herdsmen. There really wasn't any population there, simply because there wasn't enough water and you couldn't grow crops. You couldn't really put a city there. You have to have that ability to do that, to feed those people in the city. So we can glean from this fact that up to this point, no one had disputed the ownership of these wells. Abraham dug them. They were his wells. They just came and filled them in. They weren't having fights over them. And if there were the herdsmen of Abimelech were there, which they most likely were, they would have had a real problem with Isaac being there. Again, remember how big his flocks and herds are. He's got to have enormous flocks and herds to feed, take care of all of his family and servants. So what does Isaac do? He just cleans them out. And if you've ever done much digging, it's a whole lot easier to clean out a hole that was filled in than to dig a new hole in the desert. Mostly due to all the rocks that you have to pull out. So he just digs them out, and sets them back up as wells again, and he even gives them the same name, which is, makes sense. Why would you change the names? Then you'd get all confused about, traveling and where you were going. So he gave them the same names his father had given them because they've been there for quite a while. Let's see. We can also see from this that although God made Isaac extremely wealthy, he was still responsible for working very hard. It's one thing we see in the life of Abraham, we see it in Isaac, we see it in Jacob. They're very hard workers. I mean, they're really wealthy, and they could basically delegate everything to other people, but they're always out there working, improving like that. There's no water. Other people say, well, let's move to an area where there's water. Abraham says, well, let's dig a well and find water. And, digging a well back in that day with a pick and a shovel was not easy. And so they would go down, and also God blessed them that every time Abraham dug a well, what happened? He found water, which is very unusual as well. And so he worked very hard to maintain his wealth. He had a lot to take care of. Think of what he had to do. He had to dig wells, maintain the wells, find pasture, grow crops, have a system that could help feed everyone. When you've got that many people, that takes a big kitchen and a lot of cooks and so on and so forth to help feed all those people. I mean, a lot of them would cook at their own homes and stuff. But still, you had to coordinate all of that food and growing it, getting it, and making bread and all those things. Which led me to speak to something that a lot of people don't really know much about. And that's something that was called two different things, either the Christian work ethic or the Puritan work ethic. The Puritans were some of the first ones that it was really known about, was that how hard Christians will work doing any kind of labor in the past. Hopefully we'll keep doing that, because the Bible is the only religious book, the only book that puts real value on manual labor. In all other cultures, manual labor is always looked down on. That's what the slaves, the peasants, the servants, that's what they do. We're the landowners, we don't do that stuff. And that was true from early history all the way up into the medieval times and beyond. It was frowned upon. I mean, in fact, you would be kicked out of social circles if you actually managed your own property in England or other parts of Europe during the 16, 17, 1800s, because that's not what aristocrats did. There were a few that would do it, but they always had other people manage it, and that's how they all ended up in debt and broke. That's why you had all these people in Europe that had titles and positions, but no money, because they didn't manage and they didn't work and they didn't. In America, what happened was, the Spanish basically owned all of California. And all of them, most of them were dons, upper level, and had huge ranches. Same thing. They didn't believe in manual labor. So manual labor is managing your own property. That's still considered labor. And so by the time the Americans moved west and made it to those areas, most of these guys were deep, deep in debt. So the Americans went around and bought up their debt. But see, a Spanish person would never foreclose on a don, someone with great political power. We're Americans. We don't care. We have no respect for that, and they started taking the ranches away. And that's kind of how we ended up owning California. Was we went in there and we were the Yankees, we're willing to work hard, and we didn't have an issue with any of this, because most of us came out of that Christian worldview, coming to America, and we're willing to work, and pretty soon they owned all the ranches and all the property. And so we see that it goes all the way back to this time. God's people are willing to do what's necessary to work, to do manual labor. Because what did God do? What's the very beginning of the book tell us? God created, which is work. And he even says in many places, I created with my own hands. He doesn't really have hands, but for us to understand it, but God's just saying, no other gods of anybody did manual labor. No way did they do that. Yet God did. And so it carried down through the people. And so you'll notice in most places where Christians have gone and settled, they work hard and life is better and they improve and so on and so forth. So let's see. Now, we're told that he's going to end up going to a place called Rehoboth. But before we get there, this is the area where Rehoboth is. This is the area. Here's Gerar, the city. So this is the area basically where Isaac was moving about with his animals, so on and so forth, to keep everything going. So look at verses 19 to 22. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." So he called the name of the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. So he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, saying, "For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." So he goes and digs wells, and these other herdsmen from Gerar find out about it, and they come and dispute, it's ours. They didn't dig it. They had nothing to do with it. It just happened to be in the land of Gerar, and they would say it's ours. Now, could Isaac have said, "No, it's mine, go away"? Remember why he had to move away from Gerar. He had so many people, the city was afraid of him. So he could have flexed his muscle and said, "Nope, I dug the well, it's mine, go away." But he didn't. He's in someone else's land. He doesn't want to cause trouble. So even though he went through all that work, he moves on. Yes, Tom?
The names of mine are Coral, Hostily, and Open Spaces.
Those are the meanings.
Oh.
The translation I'm using tries to be as literal as it can, so it uses the original language for name places. But that's what they each mean. Esek means contention. That was the first well. Sitnah means enmity, which is to actively oppose, to be actively opposed or hostile to someone or something. And so he gave it the name of what happened there. They came and fight with him. They want the well. He calls it contention. The next one he calls it enmity. When he gets to Rehoboth, Rehoboth speaks of room. Now we have room. They're finally far enough away that they're not in the area of Gerar's or Abimelech's herdsmen. So I put mine a note that said these herdsmen sound like liberals. They didn't dig it, but they want it and distribute it to everybody else, type of thing. So, and I'm putting this on the internet, so I'll probably get in trouble. But I've been in trouble before. So, all right. So, not wanting to create an incident, Isaac's willing to move on. So, I also learned something about Isaac here. He's not confrontational. He's like, I'm in someone else's land. I'll just move on and go about my business. And he is basically living what the Bible tells us to do. Love your neighbor, put their needs before your own. Rather than fight with him, he says, "Okay, you can have it. We'll move on." God always enables us. He's like his dad, where he digs a hole in the ground, he finds water. And so he says, "We'll move on." And then he moves and digs another one. And they come up against that one, and they want that one too. And so he ends up in this place called Rehoboth here, where he digs a well. And I imagine this time Isaac's got smart and sent guys ahead and said, "Look around, see if there's any of those herdsmen out in that area. And if there's not, then we'll dig a well there. I'm getting tired of digging wells and giving them away." And Rehoboth means broad place or room. So we found a big place where there's room enough for us and our animals. And that was the smartest thing to do. I mean, he could have fought back, but then he could have gotten into a war with Gerar. It would just make a giant mess. And it was much easier to just move on.
Have you ever heard of dowsing?
Yeah, I can do it.
You can. So, great. I want to talk to you later. Please. But, I knew this guy. He was really, 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 he's not alive now. I moved to Sedona in 76 when it was a great town. And I knew this guy, and he had some people he was teaching. I didn't really get into it, but I knew he actually, I think, worked for the government as far as finding water.
Mm-hmm.
He was really good at it, and I thought, well, maybe some of these guys had that
Might have been.
quality.
My grandfather was a well driller, and my grandfather would find wells with a metal rod.
Really?
They'd take a long metal rod and bend like a long welding rod,
Right.
bend it in a right angle, hold it loosely in your hand, and walk across land. And if there's water, or even if there's metal pipes, that thing will turn. All on its own. And he told me it'll even turn the way the pipes are run. Mm-hmm. And he said the way you can tell if you can do this is you put one of those in your hand, hold it loosely, put your other hand out and do this, and that rod will follow your hand like you're magnetic. And that happens for me. You can move it back and forth.
Well, he used different things, wood also.
Some people use sticks.
Right.
But my grandfather rarely drilled a dry well, even down to 600, 800, 900,000 feet. I tried it at my house.
Didn't work.
Well, apparently in my backyard, I found, an old propane line. I dug about 7 or 8 different holes and found different things in them. The other thing is you don't know how deep the water is. It could be down there, So I finally gave up because I found too much. So I just took my tractor and started at the back and dug till I pulled the water line out of the ground. And I went, there it is. Because I got tired of digging.
Some have talent on that, some don't. Yeah,
Yeah, Debbie says I'm the best in the world at finding water lines, but not when I'm trying to. All right. So he moves on, and finally finds a place where there's plenty of room. He's got a well. And so he settles there and makes Rehoboth his headquarters. Now, he won't stay in one place forever. He's going to end up having to move because eventually his herdsmen will get too far out. But he can stay in areas for a while, several years probably. Okay, verse 23 to 25. From there he went up to Beersheba. So you can see that as well up here. That's a previous well. And the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. Interesting. So there's Beersheba. Oh, I forgot this one. Yeah. There's Beersheba. Now, there's already a well there. That's where Hagar went and met God, and there was a well there. That is also where Abraham made the treaty with Abimelech back 90 years ago. And so there's already a well there. So, you ask yourself, why are they digging the well? And this is the one he made a covenant with Abimelech and sealed it with 7 ewe lambs. Abraham dug this well in this area and sealed it with 7 ewe lambs, and that's how it got its name of Beersheba. So now during this time, he also comes to him in a dream or a vision. It doesn't tell us how. Whether he was awake or asleep or whatever, it doesn't matter. God spoke to him and just reiterates the promise to bless him and give him accountable offspring. As long as he's sticking with God, and the same promise he gave to Abraham, he now gives to him. But it's interesting how God keeps mentioning, let's see, in verse 24, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your offspring. Why? For my servant Abraham's sake. It keeps going back to Abraham's faithfulness. That's why this is happening. Now Isaac needs to be faithful, but it's happening because Abraham is faithful. And God's going to carry it out no matter what, because Abraham was faithful. And so it also shows us that one, ancestor can be faithful to God and bring about an enormous difference in the lives of his descendants from that point forward. Even in the Bible it says that God smiles upon the 1,000 generations of those that love him and are obedient to him. Similar kind of issue here. It's a fulfillment of that issue. Let's see. So Isaac follows in his father's footsteps, for he learned from him. He builds an altar of uncut stone, because that's what God commanded. There he sacrifices animals, and there he worships God. When it says that he called upon the name of the Lord, that type of thing, it means they worship God there. And then he dug another well. Now, we're not told why he did this. There was already a well there. Perhaps the Philistines had filled it in. I kind of doubt it, because he's far enough out that he's not running into any of them anymore. Or the other well could have gone dry. We don't really know why. Or he may have just needed a well in a different place in the same area. Whatever the reason, he dug another well and then gave it basically the same name of Sheba. Okay, verse 26. When Abimelech went to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his army, Isaac said to them, Why have you come to me, saying that you hate me and have sent me away from you? Isaac's getting a little testy here. They said, We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So he said, Let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you. Does this sound familiar? Same thing happened with Abraham just previously, with the same people with the same titles again, Phicol, Abimelech. And now here's verse 29, here's the covenant, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they rose early and exchanged oaths. And Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. That same day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug, and said to him, We have found water. He called it Sheba, Therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. So it has the same name that Abraham had given it as well. And it's still called that. When it says to this day, it doesn't mean to this day. It means to the day when this was written and the people. It could still be that to this day. We can still find Beersheba in Israel, that kind of stuff. They know where it is. But it doesn't. Some I've seen people take that and think it means till today and forever. It's not what it's saying. It's saying to when it was written, to that day, it was still that name. So.
What does that mean? Mine says oath. Is that the meaning of it?
What? No, and they take oaths. They swear to each other.
No, it says, hold on. No.
Yeah, and Beersheba means the place of oath. It also means seven ewe lambs, but it also means the place of an oath.
Oh, okay. She said it.
Well, let's see. Of course, when they show up, Isaac's very curious. Why are they there? You threw me out of the city. I went far, far away, and now you followed me here. Why are you here? And I think he is getting a little upset with them by this point. He's put up with a lot from these guys so far. And he's not real confrontational, but he's been pushed far enough now that he's getting a little confrontational. Why are you here? Because remember what he said, you hate me and you threw me out. So why have you followed me? So, what we find is Abimelech can see that God is with Isaac, just like the previous Abimelech. It's obvious. It's obvious God is blessing these people. Remember, Isaac planted a field previously. What was his return? 100 times. Nobody gets 100 times. They get maybe 2 times, 3 times, as much as 12 times, but he harvested 100 times what he planted. That's enormous. Only that's abnormal. That's unusual. That's God being involved in it. And also remember, and a lot of times with us in modern Christianity, we forget or don't know or forget, either one, that in ancient times people were much more controlled and involved in their gods. Their gods were the ultimate thing in life everywhere you went, and gods controlled everything. Everything. That's why they had hundreds of them. Household gods, family gods, county gods, city gods, gods of the market. They had all kinds of gods because gods totally controlled their lives. The sad part is none of these gods existed, but yet that happened. And almost all of the ancient priests and temples in a very short period of time were as wealthy or wealthier than the king in the kingdom because everybody brought their stuff to please the gods and so on and so forth. It's why you'll find if you read a lot of this history that there are a lot of times there were a lot of tension and even battles between priests and kings. Because the king didn't like it when the priests had more money than they did. Or when they had to borrow money from the temple to go to war or something like that. And had as big an influence or even bigger with the people type of thing. But it totally controlled their lives. Much more so than even we in Christianity to think of it today. Because their lives, every moment of every day, was controlled by a god of some kind that you had to appease and so on and so forth. And so if anything happened, who would they attribute it to?
The gods.
The gods. If you had an abnormal harvest, it has to be the gods. In any battle, whoever won, the winning side, always saw it as their god was more powerful than the loser's god. That they didn't see it as 2 armies; it was 2 gods. That type of thing. So Abimelech can easily see that God's with Isaac. God is Isaac's extremely wealthy. He's getting wealthier all the time. Because all of those servants he has, that they stop having kids. Nope, they're still having kids. So that's growing. His animals are having all their kids and all their babies, and that's growing. And so he's getting wealthier and more powerful all the time. So this is obvious. And so Abimelech, like the previous Abimelech, which was probably his father, wants to get on Isaac's good side, just like his dad wanted to get on Abraham's good side. And because he's blessed of God. And see, Abimelech understands if we get into a contention with Isaac, it's our God fighting his God, and his God is obviously more powerful because look at what he's doing in his life. So he comes to make a treaty with him. Now what Isaac does is he extends the normal Middle Eastern hospitality. Taking, even your enemies in the Middle East, they will take in and feed, if you need it. And that's a part of their culture. So he feeds them. And also they marked almost every special occasion, especially covenants, with a feast. Feasts were big, big deals in those days, much more so than how we see them today. They were huge deals. And so he creates a feast for Abimelech and his men because they're going to make a covenant, a treaty, and that marks that. Now, Abimelech is not fully informed about what's been going on between Isaac's herdsmen and Abimelech's. Because notice he says, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good. Is that true? No, Abimelech's herdsmen have taken 2 wells away from him. But Abimelech doesn't know that. Now, Isaac could bring it up, but again, he's probably like, what's the point? I've already moved farther on. They're not here. We'll just be done with that. So so they make the covenant. They seal it with oaths and with the feast. Those guys leave, and that's the day that the servants come and tell them we hit water. They started digging the well. We found water. And then he gives it the name Sheba. And therefore the city is named Beersheba to this day. Beer and Sheba to this day. The place of the oath, that type of thing. All right, verse 34. It's funny, it seems like we suddenly shift gears dramatically. The next thing we read is, when Esau was 40 years old, like, whoa, wait a minute. How did we get to Esau? But you'll see in a minute why. When Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So at the end of this chapter, as we're bringing this chapter to a close, we are given this weird little snippet about Esau and his wives. Number 1, how many women does he marry? 2. How many is he supposed to marry?
1.
Even back then, 1. Isaac had 1 wife. Abraham should have had 1 wife. The others got him into a lot of trouble. And they were kind of more concubines, even though they were called wives. Yet he immediately goes out and he gets 2 wives. But what's going on is we're discussing the major events in Isaac's life. The getting thrown out of Gerar, the making of the covenant. Well, this is a major issue too, because Esau goes totally against God's will. Were they supposed to marry Canaanite women? No. Yet he's married 2 Hittites who live in Canaan, in the area where they are. And so he knows he's not supposed to, but he does anyway. He's supposed to go get a wife where? From his own people, same as Isaac. Abraham did for Isaac. He needed to get it from his own people. Where Jacob will get his wife, from Laban and from his own people. But Esau doesn't. It also shows us that Esau is disobedient. He doesn't care about God or God's commands. Remember, he doesn't really care about the birthright. He sold it for what? Bowl of soup, which means he doesn't care. He doesn't care about the promise to inhabit the land, because that's also from God. He wants to do his own thing, go his own way. And now we know why God picked Jacob over Esau, because Esau has no intentions of following God, being obedient, none of that. He's going to do his own thing. And because he married these local women, that of course makes life difficult for Isaac and Rebekah, especially Isaac, because Esau is Isaac's favorite. And so his favorite son goes directly against everything he's been taught, and not just against what he's been taught, but against God. Now Esau's wives, who would they worship? The gods of the Hittites. So that would bring false worship into the family of Isaac and Abraham and all of that. And that's why God tells them, don't marry outside your clan, because they worship God. Even the family back in the Mesopotamian area worshiped God. So here's where we get a clear understanding kind of Esau's character and his, it really looks like he doesn't even believe in God. Because, there's bad stuff that happens, they've been told, if you're not obedient to God. Esau doesn't seem to care. He's just going to do what he wants. So basically, what did Esau do? Broke his parents' hearts. And it was probably worse for Isaac than it was for Rebekah, because Esau's his favorite. And he wanted Esau to be the one to inherit and all that kind of stuff. And that's where we go with the next chapter. In chapter 27, verse 1. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son?" And he answered, "Here I am." He said, "Behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. And prepare for me delicious food such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." So Isaac's old. Remember, he lives, if I remember, 180, I believe is how old he lives to. And he knows he could die at any time. He's already gone blind. I imagine the rest of his body's not working all that great either, And so he doesn't know when he's going to die, of course, so he wants to get things taken care of. And when he says he wants to give a blessing, that's not just words, of a blessing. This is a blessing by a man of God to the person who's supposed to inherit the promise and all that. So it's actually a prophecy. The blessing is a prophecy, and you'll see that as we get into it, that's what's going to happen. And so, and again, one of the reasons Isaac and Esau to get food was, what did I tell you? All great events are marked by what? A meal, feasting, food. In their culture, eating together was one of the most intimate things two people could do. That goes all the way up into the 1st, 2nd centuries. We don't talk, to us a meal is to just eat food. And you might have friends over or whatever. But to them, it was a tremendously intimate thing. And the person that you had over to eat meant they were a very close friend and so on and so forth. It was a much bigger deal than it is to us. And so that's, again, why they use feasting to mark all these different things. Plus, remember in their day, now this is not true with Isaac because God's blessed him so much, but as we talked about a while back, I talked about food security and how difficult it was for people to get food, especially at the lower ranks. That's why feasting was such a big deal. If you have to struggle to get food all the time, when somebody throws a big party and there's lots of food around, that's a big, big deal. Particularly with peasants didn't eat a lot of meat, or the poor people, because it's expensive. But when a rich person threw a big party for whatever reason, they would serve meat. And it might be the only time you ate meat the entire year. It was during these festivals. And also with the religious festivals, it was the same thing. The temple would provide the meat, because like I said, they were very wealthy. So he wants to give Esau the blessing. Now, is this a problem? Who has God already said will inherit the land before he was even born? Jacob. God made that very clear. So what is it that Isaac's trying to do? He's trying to give the blessing to his favorite son. Not the one God said to give it to, his favorite son. So at this point, he's actually being disobedient to God's command and God's prophecy. That he's going to, he's bound and determined to give the blessing and the inheritance to Esau. You know what I always say? There's what? The easy way to follow God and the hard way. And he chose the hard way because is Jacob going to get the blessing? Yep, but it's going to be the hard way during this time. So now it's a prophetic blessing that's going to come true in the life of the person who receives it. Now, I put the scripture up here to remind us. This is what God said to Rebekah. Remember, the twins are fighting in the womb already? And so he says, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. So God already said Jacob gets the land. Jacob inherits. And yet Isaac is trying to give it to Esau. So he's letting his feelings for Esau overrule God's prophecy and plan. Anybody here ever had that happen where your emotions overruled what God told you to do? It's all happened to all of us. It happens to everybody. And that's why God is I kind of hate to use the term anti-emotional. I mean, God expresses love and all that, but God tells us that we have to be very, very careful of emotion. It lies to us 90% of the time. We feel things that are not necessarily true.
Absolutely.
Have you ever felt somebody didn't like you?
No.
And you go to them and say, why don't you like me? And they say, what are you talking about? But that's our emotions lying to us. What's going on?
So God's talking to us.
So, when God tells us all through the Bible, we have emotions and they have a place, but our emotions lie to us. Be very careful. And it's emotions that often drag us away from doing what God wants us to do. It's too scary, or I don't understand, or whatever. And so we have to be very careful of that. So,
and sometimes we believe those emotions are real, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it's tricky.
And it's not real.
And it's not at all. It's
because they lie to us all the time.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Unfortunately, Isaac chooses the hard way at this point in time, and he's going to have to deal with what's going to happen. All right, verse 5. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. Now, all the times I've read this before, I simply saw Rebekah as doing something underhanded to get her favorite the blessing. But you can look at it another way and say, maybe, perhaps, we don't know this for true, but maybe she's trying to pull it back around to being obedient to God's command. Jacob's supposed to get it. Now, she's doing it in a sneaky, underhanded way. It would have been much better if she'd gone in and just said to Isaac, dude, you can't do this. God said Jacob, But instead, now you know where Jacob gets his sneakiness. Because who's the one being sneaky here? His mom. Absolutely. She kind of sounds like what we call a stage mom. I want my kid to succeed and get whatever, and I'm going to do whatever it takes, kind of thing. So we don't really know exactly what's going on. Could be a little of both. But in a way, she's actually fulfilling God's command. Now, she's doing it in a wrong way, so that's not God doing this. That's just her. But yet, she is still doing it. So she's going to make sure that Jacob gets the blessing. Now, Jacob, true to his nature, he's scared to death to do this. What if Dad finds out? What if he figures it out? He's going to curse me, not bless me. And again, remember, if it's a curse coming from Isaac, it's going to be the same as a blessing. It's going to be a prophetic event that will happen. And it's not just words coming from him. So, she puts her own plan in motion to get the blessing for Jacob. She goes and tells him to get 2 high-quality goats. She prepares them, and who better than her would know how to make Isaac's favorite food? She's been cooking for this man for a very, very, very long time. So she says, I know what to make that he'll, it's his favorite food. Now, she knows that Isaac can barely see. And so she's going to key off that because she's going to fool him into thinking Jacob is Esau. My guess is he probably doesn't hear. He hears, but probably not great. But he does hear. Let's see, we've got a minute. So we're going to have to stop there. So next we're going to, of course, go into the part where, I found an ancient picture of Esau.
All right.
There you go.
Which one is
There's Esau and Jacob. That's probably closer to what they actually look like.
Look like good friends.